When I was a child, my late uncle's chilling ghost stories had a way of seeping into my young mind, filling it with vivid images of the supernatural. His stories were so convincing that, as a kid, it was impossible not to believe in the eerie possibilities he presented. He really loved freaking out his little nieces and nephews. The centerpiece of many of my uncle's eerie narratives was my grandmother's old house, a relic from the past that stood a short distance up the road from the family cemetery. It had a history intertwined with the supernatural, making it the perfect setting for his stories. Several family members had passed away within its walls, including my grandfather and her 2 infant daughters who had met untimely deaths. My grandmother often spoke of beings that visited her at the foot of her bed. Their nature, a mystery, ghosts or angels, no one could say for sure. Most of the family dismissed her accounts as hallucinations, but my mother and I believed her, and my uncle frequently brought her visions to life in story form. Among the many stories I remember him telling, there were 2 in particular that left an indelible mark on my imagination. The tale of a mysterious light that wandered through the cemetery at the witching hour, and a ghost that had visited multiple generations there. Over the years, however, I had 3 paranormal experiences of my own, all focused around that same house, making me wonder if perhaps my uncle's tales had been more than just spooky stories. My very first encounter happened on a weekend when we were visiting my grandma. I was just 7 or 8 years old at the time. I was sitting on the living room floor playing with toys. Sometime later, I looked at my mom and told her I had to go to the bathroom. When I reached the bathroom door, something caught the corner of my eye that totally freaked me out. I saw an apparition so shockingly real that I froze in place. Descending the staircase just beyond the bathroom door was someone wearing a pair of old, light-colored brown pants, accompanied by heavy brown work boots. I couldn't see above the waist, and I knew no one was ever allowed to go upstairs. These were not the attire of the living. They were spectral, anachronistic remnants from another era, like something out of the 1920s or 1930s. My heart raced and I struggled to process the impossible sight before me. The pants descended the stairs with an eerie, deliberate slowness, then stopped. Panic surged through me. I slammed the bathroom door shut and frantically looked for a place to hide. My heart was pounding relentlessly. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. Could it be my late grandfather who had passed away when my mother was just 9 years old? I didn't have long to think about it as I noticed that the bathroom door wouldn't open. It had no lock, yet I found myself locked inside, desperately kicking and screaming for help. Minutes felt like hours as I fought to open the stubborn door, my cries for help going unheard. Strangely, the living room, where my parents, grandmother, and aunt were gathered, was just on the other side of the bathroom wall, but no one seemed to hear my frantic cries and screams. The door finally opened and I bolted out of there, running back to the living room. I shut the hallway door with such force that it interrupted my family's conversations. They looked at me puzzled by my sudden entrance. The freaky part is that no one had heard my screams or me pounding on the door. I never told anyone about my encounter, including my parents, because I didn't want to be thought of as some nutcase. When I was younger, I used to live next to this very old and run-down church. This church was one of the town's original buildings from the late 1800s. It had been remodeled a few times, but mostly the building had maintained its original design. It was a large, square, white plaster-sided building with a very short bell tower capping the top of the roof. The church had gone through several owners for various reasons, and had also been used for several purposes while I was growing up. When I was very young, it was basically abandoned and kids would sometimes play in it. I never really liked being in that church. It just made me feel uncomfortable, so I would rarely go into the church even when other kids were there. At some point, it became a night school. The teenagers that had to attend the school would say they would see spooky things out of the corner of their eyes or hear strange sounds when no one was talking. Very shortly after becoming a night school, they moved the school to another building. They said it was because they needed more space, but all the teens joked that it was because the teachers were frightened of the building. After being empty for another year or so, it was rented out to a family who turned it into their house. The family was lower middle class, just like my family. and they rented it because it was cheap. Their living room was basically the bottom floor of the building. Since the church hadn't been remodeled into a proper house, it was just being used as one. Even then, I didn't really like that church. It was directly attached to our yard, and I wouldn't get too close to it at night because it creeped me out. Despite the creepy church house, our families became fairly close in the short time they lived there, and my mom would babysit their infant for them pretty often. I was around 13 at the time and was friends with the 2 other kids who lived in the church. They would tell me they thought the church was a little creepy at night too, but nothing really interesting had happened to them. One night, my younger sister got scared of something and woke me up. She said she heard something weird outside her window and wanted me to check it out for her. Her bedroom window is on the 2nd floor and faces the church. Now, I am not super keen on doing this, but I feel like I have to, so I do it anyway. I get to her window and look outside. To my relief, I don't see anything of interest. No marks on the window, nothing outside in the yard, and no cliched branches rubbing on the window. I begin to tell her it's fine when we both hear what sounds like a baby crying in the distance. I realize it must be the neighbor's baby and tell her not to worry about it. I just think to myself that their baby must be incredibly loud for us to hear it over here. I take another look out the window to see a woman in a red dress walking by the church window, cradling what must have been the baby. I get chills down my spine and look away quickly. I assume it was my neighbor's mom and decide it's time to go back to bed. A few months later, it's the neighbor's turn to babysit us for my mom. My sister and I have to stay the night in the creepy church with our neighbors. The neighbor kids showed us around their house to make sure we knew where everything was. The 2 kids' bedrooms were upstairs next to the nursery they set up for the baby. Mom and Dad's room was downstairs because it was the biggest bedroom. The kitchen and bathroom were downstairs and attached to the living room. It was an interesting layout for a house, but it was obviously still just a church with a living room set up in the main hall. We spent most of the night watching movies and cartoons and were successfully distracted for the majority of the evening. Eventually, it was bedtime, so we rolled out our sleeping bags and went to sleep in the living room. At some point in the night, we were all woken up by the baby crying from upstairs. It was annoyingly loud. We hoped the baby would just stop on its own, but after waiting for a while, the neighbor kid decided it was time to wake up their parents. The mom came out of their room wondering what was wrong, and we told her the baby was crying. She looked really confused and listened quietly for a moment, and obviously heard the baby crying. She then turned around and woke up her husband and said something to him in a frightened tone. It was dark, so we couldn't see much into their bedroom, but after a moment she came out of their bedroom holding their sleeping baby. The crying continued. Her husband comes out of their bedroom holding a broom like a baseball bat and tells us all to stay downstairs. We are all terrified and go into the living room to sit on the couch and wait for him to come back. As he climbs the squeaking stairs, we can still hear the baby crying while their baby is still fast asleep. Suddenly, the crying stops. You can hear the husband walking around on the old floorboards, creaking with every step. He yells, "Come on out or I'll call the police." No response. After a while of creaking floorboards, he comes back downstairs and shrugs his shoulders. "Probably an injured animal or something. Must have scared it away," he says. Despite that, we all spent the rest of the evening by the couch together. They moved away shortly after, and the church remained uninhabited for several years after that. A few years after the baby incident, I became friends with someone who had moved into the house across the street from that church after I had moved away. When I learned he had lived across the street from where I used to live, I told him how I always hated that church. He agreed, and before I could tell him my story, he told me one of his own. He told me that he had once been getting home late when he thought he heard someone yelling in the distance. He wasn't able to make out any words, but he was sure he heard someone yelling something from far away. So he started looking around when he spotted a woman in a red dress circling inside the bell tower of the church, walking where there used to be a floor. His story made me shudder as I remembered the woman outside my sister's window. I'm not even sure where to begin with this. I just wanted somewhere to talk about this with people who won't think I'm crazy. I work at a school/daycare, and there's a demon in it. or possibly several. As someone who has never had a for certain paranormal experience, this was a hard pill to swallow. My belief was always more of a, oh well, it could be real, and I am not enjoying finding out for sure. This is awful. It's terrifying and nerve-wracking, and I want to throw up just thinking about going to work tomorrow. I am searching for a new job as hard as I can, but it's slow going. It started with a particular toddler room called T5. Since I started working there, I never liked going in there. Couldn't put my finger on why exactly, but I hated T5. I thought it was just that the kids were really out of control, really mean and aggressive for toddlers, but it ended up being more than that. I was in there, giving a break to their main teacher, I'm afloat, and all the kids were taking their nap. The room was dark, no sound except a quiet, white noise machine. Then I heard something around the corner at the sink. The dishes start clinking like someone is doing the dishes. It's a Montessori school, so we have real dishes. I looked around the corner and nothing was there. Sat back down. It started up again. I shrugged it off. Next time I was in there, the closet door opened by itself. I still tried to shrug it off. Other things were happening too. I noticed I was suddenly having a lot of weird health problems, mostly related to reproductive stuff. I was getting bad dizzy spells and double vision, but I didn't make the connection that it only was happening at work and only when I was in T5 or adjacent rooms. Then, another teacher, who I'd become friends with, mentioned offhand that she and her daughter, who also had worked there, had felt like the place had really negative energy. When I asked what she meant, she tentatively admitted that she'd seen weird things. Without me telling her first, I asked her what she saw, and she also described dishes clinking, doors opening, hearing a deep voice speaking from the ceiling, and dizzy spells and other weird health stuff. She also told me, don't have proof of this or anything, that her former co-teacher saw stuff too. She also had 2 unexplained miscarriages while she worked there, and now that she quit, she's pregnant again and almost due with no complications. This teacher also told me that the former main teacher of T5 had been into occult stuff. I don't know if this was true or not. I only met her once, and all I noticed was that she was a really snappish and negative person who no one else could stand. She quit a week after I started. I do, however, know that 3 current teachers are also into occult stuff based on their social media posts. All 3 also bullied me and another teacher over being Christian. After that, it got worse. I felt like I was being targeted or attacked. I feel dizzy, like the floor is tilting almost all the time when I'm in there. My body gets weirdly racked with pain that doesn't subside till I leave the building. This horrible, dark depression comes over me like life is pointless. I close my eyes and see glimpses of knives cutting my skin. During nap time, when the kids are asleep, is always when the thing really acts up. In T5, dishes clink every time, once the sink even turned on. Then whatever it was started knocking glasses on the floor. Another day during my nap, I got my air cut off for about 5 seconds like something had me by the throat. Then one of the almost 2-year-olds pointed to the doorway of the classroom and nervously said, "There, a ghost in there." She and another child often stare at something towards the ceiling and burst into uncontrollable crying and screaming. Sounds like claws tapping on the glass window happens all the time, and shadow figures glide past the big outside windows. The other day, another teacher who I had not talked to about any of this nervously told me the bathroom door in her classroom closed itself and clicked locked, despite the fact that it scrapes on the floor and has to be pushed really hard to close. Prior to this, my work bestie, the only other religious employee, had been the only one to say she'd seen stuff. She quit shortly after. Now a third teacher, not religious, had seen stuff too. Then, last week, I saw it. It was like a black diamond shape in the air, above the shoulder, and a little bit behind a teacher standing in the hallway. The shape was kind of like a cloak, draped, but mostly just a black mass with blurry edges. The head wasn't really describable. The closest thing would be a cross between a vulture skull and a plague doctor mask. I only saw it for a second and jumped out of my skin, but I saw it. It's worth noting that the teacher it was behind is a complete a-hole who probably shouldn't be working with kids. And he has weird mood swings and alternates between hitting on female teachers and acting aloof, and yells at the kids a lot. Today I was supervising napping kiddos in an older classroom. That class has one autistic boy who is not very verbal. He was sound asleep, and I was sitting in a chair between him and the bathroom. I suddenly began to feel really cold, and the familiar I'm being watched feeling, so I knew something was in there. Then I heard things being scooted around in the bathroom. It was quiet enough not to wake up the kids sleeping right by the bathroom, but the little nonverbal boy suddenly woke up, pointed at something, and screamed. He isn't like that at all. I ran and hugged him and said, "Get out," at the thing. It took a few minutes, but the feeling faded, and the little boy laid back down. I have gotten enough confirmation that this crap is real. How do you deal with this? I feel traumatized. I hate this. I can only talk about it for sure with the one teacher, but everyone in the building acts dark and depressed. I'm having night terrors, anxiety attacks are increasing just from having to go to work and be around this. If other people weren't experiencing it too, I would think I was going insane, but others have. And the kids see stuff. Plus, I only experience stuff at work. Everything is fine as soon as I'm not in the building. Please let me know if you've seen an entity like this before, if you know what it is. And any advice you can give me of how to deal with the fear would be much appreciated.